Bonjour, bon après-midi, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Bélan. I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at MISC to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. La vision de l'Institut d'études canadiennes de McGill est de promouvoir une meilleure compréhension du Canada. Pour que cette vision se concrétise, l'Institut s'est donné comme mission de faire progresser la société canadienne, principalement en organisant des conversations sur des sujets qui sont importants pour les citoyens et les citoyennes, en formant des étudiants et en motivant les gens à façonner le Canada de demain. Enfin, nous favorisons la recherche interdisciplinaire sur le Canada. It is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, David Birnbaum. David served 2 mandates as the Liberal member of the National Assembly for the riding of Darcy McGee. That was from 2014 to October 2022. He was parliamentary assistant to the Premier and also Minister of Education and Higher Education and Minister responsible for the status of women under the Liberal government of Premier Philippe Couillard, and the official opposition critic for relations with the English-speaking community, mental health, intergovernmental affairs, et la francophonie canadienne in his second term. He is the former replacement chair of National Assembly Commissions and the former vice chair of the Special Commission on the Evolution of End-of-Life Care in Quebec. So he's done a lot of other things, but time is limited. Alors, je voudrais maintenant ici t'accueillir, David, donc pour cette présentation. Et le titre, c'est Language, Inclusion, Immigration and Unity, and it's about the future of the Liberal Party of Quebec, l'avenir du Parti libéral du Québec. David est avec nous à l'Institut durant cette année universitaire jusqu'au printemps. Et il nous aide dans la préparation des cours, dans l'organisation de différents événements. Alors, David, it's all yours.
Merci, le professeur Bélan. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and a reintroduction to this formal world for me. I retired after much angsting in preparation for the elections of October 3rd, for which I decided not to be a player. There's so many prisms through which one could decide to examine the future of the Parti libéral du Québec. I've permitted myself to grab one for which I have perhaps a greater personal connection, which I think many of you would see as pillars of the Liberal Party's role over its long history in Quebec. And there are 4 pillars through which successive Liberal administrations and oppositions over 155 years of history have in some ways focused their work. So I thought it was one way into what is a deeply important discussion. And I hope you'll agree, a discussion that's not only of partisan interest to those who would choose to affiliate with the Parti libéral du Québec. If you look at those 155 years, there is no older political entity in Quebec. There's no political party that has more often served in government. And there is, to a certain extent, no party that has more consistently shaped some of the key milestones of Quebec history. Was the Parti libéral du Québec under Adelaire Godbout in 1941 that accorded the vote to women. Rather something to think that 1941 was the first time that happened, but nonetheless, that was a liberal accomplishment. Hydroelectricity, the Quiet Revolution was put in place by Le Premier ministre Jean Lesage. Quebec's language of administration as French was Bill 22 under a Bourassa administration. Quebec's Liberal Party Youth Commission, this is a little more partisan, but I think significant, has more power than any other youth division of any political entity in North America. They carry statutorily 30% of the votes in any decision-making by the Parti libéral du Québec. So in as neutral a fashion as I can express it, I won't hide my baggage, but the future of the Liberal Party is something that I would dare say I would be concerned about if I was a long-time supporter of the Parti québécois. If I was prone to support Québec solidaire, it would at least interest me. Because you're talking about a fulcrum for economic development, for a perspective on Quebec that's inclusive, I think, and modern. You're talking about a movement that is healthy for democracy. You don't have to vote for it, but it strikes me that its future is something of interest and concern probably to all of us. Now, from there, it's pretty much a fact that that future is more compromised than perhaps it's ever been in history. If you look at those 155 years, in every election since then, the Parti libéral du Québec would have garnered somewhere between 30 and 55% of the popular vote. So that's a pretty significant force. You have to find the worst total, frankly, by going back to 2018 when the CAQ government under François Legault took power, at which time that percentage dropped to 24.5%. And with all due humility, on October 3rd, the Parti libéral du Québec garnered 21 seats and 14.5% of the popular vote, less than a surprisingly emergent Parti québécois du Québec, re-emergent, and Québec solidaire, not far ahead of the Parti conservateur du Québec. So, je ne veux pas faire l'abstraction du défi, which was soberly expressed by a journalist who I admire very much, Jocelyne Richer, in the days afterwards in la presse canadienne. And she said, à 150 ans passés, le Parti libéral du Québec vit sa crise d'adolescence. Il se sent mal aimé, mal dans sa peau, se questionne sur son identité, ne sachant pas trop de quoi serait fait son avenir. So there's no minimizing the challenges ahead of the Liberal Party of Quebec, but like I say, I submit that they're of interest and pertinence to those beyond us who might be prone to support the Liberal Party of Quebec. Like I said, I thought a way in was to talk about language inclusion, immigration, and unity. I saw those subjects up close as an assistant to the Premier and, as Danielle mentioned, as the critic in this last mandate, a pretty lively one for the English-speaking community of Quebec. And my 30 or so years before were always from a perspective of minority community and minority language implication in Quebec. So I've watched with greater interest and involvement perhaps than so many of you grudgingly had our language battles, our discussions about identity and evolving nationalism from a couple of perspectives over those years. From education as executive director of the Quebec English School Boards Association, where I helped us take this, a Liberal government, to court on language of schooling, to the Supreme Court of Canada. I was executive director of Canadian Jewish Congress Quebec region, which is a community deeply anchored in Quebec, but which has its perspective on these four matters. And I spent 10 years before that as executive director of Alliance Quebec, a much maligned but a very central lobby group in the 80s and 90s, defending the English-speaking community of Quebec. So for me, these four subjects, which are central to Quebec politics anyway are a good way into how the Parti libéral du Québec will look at its future. I think the other prism I would invite you to look at, because my own sense is a torn optimism between us moving forward and a grudging realization almost every day that nos deux solitudes continuent de poursuivre. So the perspective I would ask you to remember, because in my work I have the bruises and the muscle aches to show for it. I've been pulled constantly in both directions. We don't live in a vacuum. It's so striking and was so striking to me, I was ready for it, but in my 8 years in Quebec City, to remember that not on any day is the top of mind concern the place and future of our English-speaking community here in Quebec, nor of those communities who are non-Francophone. And I don't say that with any bitterness or necessary comment. Together, those groups I've just mentioned represent perhaps close to 15% of the population, but we're talking about a minorité francophone unique en Amérique du Nord. And of course, public policy, first and foremost, is driven by the imperatives of that French-speaking majority. So these four concerns I mentioned are of interest to and of concern to French Quebecers who share this place with us and understand our mutual places within it. But their day starts quite legitimately with the future of this corner, this French-speaking corner of North America. Ça va de soi. Quand même, ce n'est pas toujours en grande évidence dans la communauté dont je fais part. I mean, I'll try not to get lost in anecdotes, but I can tell you that my months as our official opposition critic for the English-speaking community were very challenging and difficult. First of all, physically and mentally spending 200 hours in commission on Bill 96, going toe-to-toe with Simon Jean Labarrette is not the most edifying experience in the world to start with. And so often in Quebec, language has been a zero-sum game where there are winners and losers. And I perhaps naively continue to fight for my view, and I hope it would remain and be better expressed as a Quebec Liberal Party view, that it's not a zero-sum game. There's a way in and there's wins that are possible for everybody. On those pillars themselves, I'm talking a bit already about language. I think it's important to remember that no government escapes the requirement to deal with the two pillars of it, the one predominant one, like I say, ensuring that in a progressive and constant fashion, the French language is secured and allowed to flourish every day in every way, against all kinds of very real obstacles. A worldwide information market that doesn't care about this corner of North America unless economic and social and legal imperatives require it to. So that it's real to say that the implication of Amazon and the web and Netflix is absolutely real. The fact that Quebec's language has flourished so wonderfully, I've always thought, is most resulting from the determination of French Quebecers particularly, and with other allies in Quebec, to make that language flourish. But it's been legislative protection as well that has allowed that to happen. And that preoccupation is never going to go away. I remind some of those in our own community that get angry that, number one, Bill 101 is the most popular piece of legislation ever adopted in Quebec, and that what I and many others think was a rather retrograde, unimaginative, destructive, and politically expedient amending of that, Bill 96. Frankly, we worked like hell to fight it, and it's only now, almost in retrospect, that any mainstream Francophone groups are criticizing it, despite unique and arbitrary search and seizure powers for it, despite the fact, and I don't think any proudly French Quebec individual should call for this, despite the fact that it is totally shielded from any court challenge by the use of the la clause non-obstant. Despite those failings, in my view, and in the view that was taken by the Parti libéral du Québec, it's worth remembering, and in my view, kind of sobering, Bill 96 elicited and continues to elicit outrage in English-speaking Quebec, to a lesser extent amongst cultural communities, and to a very modest extent from some important and mainstream excuse me, business, entrepreneurial, and legal groups, Barreau du Québec to a certain extent. Those mainstream groups representing francophones and anglophones have been rather discreet in their reticence about this law that many would say was not that constructively done. All of which to say that on language, there are real challenges, and particular challenges that are unique to the Parti libéral du Québec, because with respect, and I don't think, I have argued with François Legault about this, I don't think if he were here he would disagree with me. Of course, a Premier of Quebec, to some extent, must and should morally give himself or herself responsibility for the well-being of all Quebecers. The electoral imperatives, to start with, on the current CAQ government, its own philosophical imperatives, and the instincts of the Premier himself, who's got a separatist background, do not behoove him to worry about this. He'll always have an ear tuned to business voices saying, mais mon Dieu, est-ce qu'il faut aller si loin que ça? Est-ce que ça c'est nécessaire? Nos filières aux États-Unis vont avoir des questions sur cette section de la Charte de la langue française. But apart from that, there is no political formation that willingly and necessarily gives itself the burden, when dealing with the terribly difficult question of language, to say, we have to find a balance. So quite objectively, it's not an opinion, that is a responsibility of the Parti libéral du Québec. Quickly, from an electoral point of view, there's a major, major constituency, I won't hide that that's part of it, which is that with some increasing grumpiness, non-Francophone Quebecers, to the greatest extent, including a majority of Montrealers, continue to support the Liberal Party of Quebec. So there is an electoral imperative to start with for the Liberal Party to look for inclusiveness on language. But it's also in the party's DNA. It's always been thus. From the perspective of rebuilding, all I can do is ask some questions. I'll offer one personal view, which has been the sort of the one straight line through my own professional path, which is, and I live so much of my life in French, is that I remain stubbornly convinced that there is a inclusive, progressive, and modern approach, tough and forward-looking, towards the flourishing, strengthening, and protection of the French language against forces that are objectively there. I remain convinced that that's the case. It's the expressed view of the Parti libéral du Québec, but I would offer you, and every successive liberal premier would agree with me, we've not always gotten it right. I remember one of my colleagues sharing with me, she'd been around for longer than me, conversation over a drink with the Premier Minister Jean Charest in his second mandate. And after a couple of swear words, he said, this bloody file, we can't get it right. So finding that balance on language is terribly difficult. I insist that it's there, and I will tell you, it's one of my disappointments watching successive leaders from whatever flank constantly retreat to their own little stereotypes when I know we can do better. You know, to see people, like colleagues who I've grown really to admire, like Véronique Yvon, met him a number of times, René Lévesque, Jean-François Lisée, to Jean Charest, to Philippe Couillard, people who are smart enough to understand that with some political risk, we can do better. We can do better than us Anglos ridiculously claiming we're second-class citizens. I have no patience for that on one hand. And Francophone nationalists suggesting that you and I are the enemies. It's just so absurd. So my prescription, and it'll be difficult on this one pillar, would be that the Liberals have no choice. First of all, they can't let go of their DNA. And it's the right thing to do to continue on language, to look for inclusive, forceful, yeah, sometimes difficult, but win-win ways to seek their way back to power, and then, whenever in power, to understand that this is a major job of any Quebec government to protect the language, to find ways to do it without losers. I remain convinced that it's possible. The way back, this will be one of the pillars that I'll be watching, and I don't have the answers, but it'll be one of the things that has to be done. On this and on the three other pillars, you need, and Claude Ryan said this in delivering to the party a list of 9 key values that should define its work, and in many ways validated its work over the history. But he said, and this is a risk of institutional arrogance getting in the way, he said, you have to continually, as a political movement, decide who you are and ask and listen to people and have them validate who you're going to be. And I told myself in retirement I wouldn't be a grand-mère, but I allowed myself to do some interviews when I saw our Parti libéral du Québec availing itself of that arrogance in an absurd way days after the election, when we got our heads handed to us in a handbasket, and fighting about who was going to play certain roles and who was going to be la troisième présidente de l'Assemblée nationale. And frankly, we can talk about this in the questions, frankly assessing that the right thing to do was to focus their early energies on removing the leader, someone I was proud to serve with, Dominique Anglade. And that's one of the real risks in moving forward, is that this party, it's part of the mechanism of who we are in Quebec, will focus on how it gets back to power without, and many commentators have said this, with humility, strength, rigor, and patience, asking who it is and listening to the suggestions with nothing off the table. If you don't do that, you're a political party slapping the face of the phenomenon you're part of, because you're saying, I don't have to hear you. You told me 85.5% of those who voted that you reject my message. Is that not a pretty clear signal to get to work? Anyway, we'll see if that happens. My own view is that you don't rush to pull out the balloons and the bumper stickers and just have a leadership convention and try and find an easy way around that. Don't think that's how it works. On the other pillars, inclusion and immigration. You look at how well, and we can't deny it, how well the CAQ government did in securing a renewed mandate with almost historic levels of support. They did it despite some statements from the Premier and one of his ministers that were absolutely outrageous and universally condemned with respect to immigrants being a burden and not finding work. I mean, the kind of dog whistle stuff that the only person who doesn't whisper about it is Donald Trump. Absolutely nuts. And they won big, and they now have the luxury with such a wide constituency. I hope it's somewhere in their DNA, I don't really think so, but moving a bit to the center. But you have a government that I don't think it's unfair to say starts from a position of some hostility towards a notion of inclusion in Quebec, towards a notion of immigration in Quebec. Early on in their first mandate, my God, in the face of what's now become a dramatic problem, la pénurie de main-d'œuvre au Québec, they ripped up 40,000 files of the most qualified immigrants in Quebec who were past step one, some of them completing their PhDs right here, some of them chemical engineers from Afghanistan and Iran and all over. They ripped up those files. So what I'm saying is on that spectrum and on the way back, this historic movement in Quebec, the Parti libéral du Québec, has in its DNA an approach to immigration that is, I think, pragmatic, humane, and fairly smart. We worked really hard in government to make sure the discussions about immigration were from a moral and sociological point of view, but also from an economic point of view. It's the history of Quebec and the rest of Canada. We need immigrants. So one of the things our party will have to look at in its rebuilding is serious and rigorous and structural ways. I would hope to maintain that approach. But again, all of these pillars have a shadow hanging over them, which I think can be dispersed through intelligence and generosity, but a shadow hanging over it, which is the normal imperative that the Quebec Liberal Party must win back the hearts and minds of a coalition of Quebec francophones. And that means the center of gravity, many polls would suggest, is a somewhat nationalistic view that Quebec francophones share. Now, to jump from there to the notion that, oh my God, French is declining in Quebec and Montreal, we're not sure we can properly identify it, but it is. To jump on that bandwagon without thinking, without looking at structural responses to, like I say, that legitimate, ever-present wish of French Quebecers to feel safe and secure looking towards the future, are there other ways to do it? And I get back to this job having to be one of listening carefully and thinking rigorously, because it's not going to be about slogans. But just to give you an example on this dichotomy, that 200 hours I spent with Simon-Jean Barrette on Bill 96 on language, and he was the former Minister of Immigration himself. Despite my persistent questions, not a word, not a bloody word on what serious tools he would put in place to allow immigrants to be part of a flourishing French Quebec. Not a goddamn word. Bills, unless they're a budget, don't have money in them, so I didn't expect to see budgets on it. But not a structural word on how to help immigrants to Quebec become common French-speaking immigrants to Quebec, whether they were French-speaking before or after. Not a word. So for me, there is space on that spectrum for a Liberal Party in its re-examination to talk about how that gets done. And just to throw out one notion, and to her credit, it was a model that Pauline Marois put into place under the second PQ government, which was a system of COFIs, they were called, the acronym for them, which was, every immigrant community will tell you, was an amazing model that accompanied newcomers to Quebec where they were in mastering French. It was hugely expensive, but that's what it cost. And again, I could never nail down Simon-Jean Barrette on where he was actually going to spend money. He spent his time just trying to depict me and the Liberal Party as Patsy's English-speaking community, and in my case, as an angry Anglo, as William Johnson or Brent Tyler, or one of the folks I spent my life fighting against. So there's room on that spectrum for a redefined Quebec Liberal Party, I think, to set as certain premises that immigration is necessary and hopeful, that it is part of the inevitable solution towards the future of French Quebec. So to me, immigration and inclusion are certainly two other pillars. A third one that we don't talk about enough is that there's nobody else who sincerely believes and will work towards Quebec remaining in Canada. Not a small matter. I mean, what I find fascinating, and I can't begrudge him because it was a stroke of genius and it worked. François Legault rebuilt l'Action démocratique du Québec in his own image and created la Coalition Avenir Québec, now in its second strong majority mandate, by deciding that the answer to the ever-present existential question of where does Quebec fit in Canada, to say proudly, I don't know. That's the question that's been on the table for 50 years, for a century and not longer. Jean-François Lisée tried to do it and got massacred because at least the PQ had a number one objective, whether one shared it or not. It got massacred. But basically, François Legault did the same thing. His answer, and to continued questions despite him having written the budget for a first year of a sovereign Quebec, despite the strong suspicion and extensive evidence that in his heart he's a sovereignist, he gained power by finding that sweet spot in a majority of Quebecers, which is, we're proud, we need to know that you are worrying every day about our French-speaking future here. We don't want to answer that fundamental question. So it's worked. It's quite absurd. I mean, I'd love to see political scientists from their space caps looking down at this a century from now. Because the answer we're living under is, I don't know. Now, I mention all of that because I insist that at some point, a normal question that defines us is going to come back. It's going to come back, and it's going to be significant in a number of ways. First of all, from day to day to day, Quebec is in a federation and has to, for the interests of Quebecers, find ways to make this federal system work. The dynamic over the past 30 years has been that incrementally and depending on the federal government, there are ways to make this work with a little song and dance. On one side, a premier of Quebec screaming and yelling because that's what you do against Ottawa. On the other side, a federal government having to open the accordion so it looks like there's great room for Quebec, which is not always accorded. Don't get me wrong. There's a very centralist government in Ottawa right now. And periodically, successive prime ministers having to remind Saskatchewan, and particularly Alberta and so on, that no, Quebec is not the tail that wags the dog. It's very legitimately different. We can make this work. But some of you will remember some hayseed, and I think it was Brockville, Ontario, stomping on the Quebec flag. And it almost got us over the top in a referendum that would have split up the country. There could at any moment be a point where push comes to shove again. Increasingly, Indigenous communities are poorly served by the constitutional regime as it sits now. There's increasing impatience in Alberta. At any point, the realities and the ambiguities of Quebec within Canada won't just be an afterthought. So it strikes me as useful, and here I know the PQ would agree with me, absolutely useful to have some serious group on the political spectrum continually identified with the preservation of Quebec within Canada. Now, how do you express that? I was really proud to have worked, it was pretty much done, but to have worked with Jean-Marc Fournier, who put together what I insist was a brilliant and generous look after 10 years of not a word on how Quebec might renew itself within the Federation. And he had not even delivered the copy to Justin Trudeau's office yet when the Prime Minister of Canada, a deeply federalist one would presume, said, no, shh, we don't want to go there. So all of which to say, I wouldn't suggest that this dialogue on where Quebec fits within Canada will get started tomorrow or a week from now or even a year from now. But it's a legitimate, it's in our DNA, it's part of who we are, so it should be a question. The Liberal Party, whether they like it or not, frankly, is properly identified as federalist. That doesn't let us off the hook for saying it, but much more important, listening to people about it and talking about how we renew it. Now, like I say, I think there's an amazing document that was put on the table and got the back of the hand. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be dusted off at some point. But that's a fourth pillar which should be amongst the prisms that decide how the party finds its way back. There are two sort of early paths that oppose each other that had been suggested to a certain extent by two very important public commentators, one of who will be speaking at a class at McGill later in the session, André Pratt, a former senator, public affairs commentator, et éditorialiste en chef de la presse. André Pratt would outline a path back along the lines I think that I've made some allusions to, would be the first to talk about how deeply difficult and lengthy this process would be. I think, like me, he would suggest, and this is probably hoping against hope, that the real leaders of it, they don't have to say that they would never say it publicly, but would understand that they're probably aiming at 2030. The job is that big, in my view. Politics being what it is, I'm not sure that will be anybody's default plan, and no one would ever say it publicly. But André Pratt would say that, and I would agree, the job is so big, if you're going to do it right, you better get yourself back on the ground and be on the map and be in the media. It's going to take another election at the least. If it's only about winning again, then what's the difference what you're talking about? You're looking at tactics. It's got to be about what needs to be made available to Quebecers as a reasonable and a smart option. Now, André Pratt, without going into the detail he would have written often about, would be talking about the party proudly talking about its pro-nationalist history in an inclusive fashion, proudly talking about its deep commitment to individual rights, to inclusion, and to positive approaches to immigration and the promotion of the French language. At another pillar, and one that's viewed as very persuasive by others, would be the one expressed by Benoit Pelletier, former Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, well-respected constitutionalist, who would talk much more aggressively about the party staking pretty nationalist turf that has been repatriated by the Coalition Avenir Québec. He would start by having Quebec adopt, which is legal under the MNA Act and our current Constitution Act, a Quebec-only constitution, which would describe our shared values and so on. He would talk about aggressively repatriating further powers. He would talk about explicitly lowballing. He wouldn't, I hope, give it the back of his hand, but lowballing the fundamental commitment to individual rights and personal freedoms by saying that the collective rights of Quebecers must always pass first. And he would express that by absolutely supporting, as he has said, Bill 96 pretty much in its entirety, and the use of the notwithstanding clause, which our Liberal Party said it would not countenance in this case. Just as a quick reminder, because that is such an important lever, it's in the Canadian Constitution. It's a legitimate tool that was, first of all, the compromise necessary for Canada to repatriate the Constitution in 1982. And it's also, I think it was viewed as a tool to be used in vitally exceptional circumstances, a tool to assure two things. One, that elected parliaments were the final word and not the courts, and to ensure that in a reasonable democratic way, the needs of society were always met, even if that might exceptionally require overriding fundamental rights. But to use this as the CAC did under 96 in a preamble to say, we don't know yet if all this is legal, we don't know if it contravenes your rights to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion. We don't know, but too bad. It's the law anyway, because in this law we are noting that notwithstanding what we have written, what's in the Constitution, this law prevails. Benoit Peltier's path back would have us comfortable with that kind of judgment. I'm not, and we'll see. So there's no easy way back, and I offer these 4 pillars because they are in some ways the flashpoints of contention amongst so many others as this party tries to find its way back. But as I started, I think it's important to recognize that this is at least an interesting discussion, but I'd submit, and I hope it's not with my partisan hat on, that it's a discussion that matters to Quebec and at some point will matter to all of Canada. So I'll leave it at that. There's all kinds of other angles, and I'll look forward to a healthy discussion. Thank you.